He came every night just for coffee. She had no idea he was the lonely CEO millionaire single dad. The small coffee shop at the corner of the busy street came alive every evening with the soft aroma of roasted beans, the clinking of cups, and the quiet chatter of customers who came to escape the noise of the outside world. Aisha, the young barista who worked there, had gotten used to recognizing faces. Most customers were regular students with books spread out, friends meeting after long days, and tired office workers scrolling through their phones. But among them all, one man stood out without even trying. He arrived almost every night, always at the same hour, just when the shop was neither too crowded nor too empty. He walked in quietly, never making a scene, and always carried himself with a kind of calm confidence. His tall frame, neat suits, and the way he carried a leather briefcase suggested he worked in some important office. Yet, despite his sharp appearance, there was something unusually soft about his manner. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, carried a quiet weight that Aisha could never quite understand. She first noticed him because of his routine. Unlike most customers who often changed their orders, he never did. He always asked for a simple black coffee, no sugar, no cream, nothing fancy. He would take the steaming cup, give her a small smile, and then sit at the same table in the corner near the window. From there, he watched the city lights, sipping slowly as if he was in no hurry to leave. At first, Aisha thought he might be waiting for someone. She had seen people glance at their watches, looking toward the door, hoping a friend or colleague would arrive. But night after night, he came alone. He would sit quietly for almost an hour, sometimes with a small notebook in front of him where he wrote something, other times just staring into his cup. When he finally left, he would nod politely at Aisha, return his cup, and disappear into the night as quietly as he had entered. There was nothing extraordinary in what he did, and yet Aisha felt a growing curiosity about him. Something about his silence pulled her attention, though she never said it aloud. She often wondered what kind of life he lived beyond that corner table. Did he have a family waiting for him at home? Was he an artist, a businessman, a professor? Or maybe he was just another lonely soul who found comfort in the small routines of life. One evening, when the rain drummed softly against the glass windows of the cafe, she found herself watching him a little longer than usual. He had come in again, almost like clockwork. His suit was damp from the drizzle outside, but he didn't seem to mind. She handed him his usual order before he even asked, and for the first time, he gave her a look of quiet surprise. His lips curved into a small smile, the kind that seemed rare for him, and he thanked her with a warmth she hadn't seen before. It was such a small moment, but it stayed with her even after he left. That night, as Aisha closed the cafe and wiped down the tables, she thought about him again. She realized she had never asked his name, never even exchanged a conversation beyond the simple exchange of coffee and thank you. And yet, he was already a part of her nightly routine as much as she was part of his. The days turned into weeks, and his presence became familiar, almost comforting. Some nights, when the shop was quiet, Aisha would sneak glances at him, wondering if she should say something more. But he always seemed so deep in thought that she didn't want to disturb him. The other staff at the cafe noticed too. "Your quiet customer is here again," one of her colleagues teased one night with a grin. Aisha laughed it off, pretending it was nothing. But deep down, she couldn't deny that she was curious about why someone so polished and refined chose to spend his nights in a modest little cafe instead of one of the grand restaurants scattered across the city. One evening, the cafe was unusually busy. A group of students had taken over 2 large tables, and the hum of conversation filled the space. When he entered, Aisha almost missed him at first, but then she spotted him weaving through the crowd with his usual calm. His table in the corner was already occupied, so he quietly chose another one nearby. He didn't complain, didn't frown, just sat down and sipped his coffee as always. That simple patience caught Aisha's attention once again. He seemed like someone who had learned to wait, someone who didn't need to rush, even when life around him was loud and chaotic. But even in the middle of all that noise, he looked out of place like a painting that didn't belong on the same wall. It wasn't that he looked better or worse than others. It was simply that he seemed to be carrying an invisible distance, a gap between himself and the world around him. Aisha often thought about asking him a question, something as simple as, "Do you work nearby, or do you come here often after work?" But each time the words rose to her lips, they vanished. She told herself it was none of her business, that maybe he valued his quiet evenings and she had no right to intrude. Still, curiosity was a strange thing, it lingered even when unspoken. The truth was, Aisha had her own quiet struggles. Working long shifts at the cafe, balancing studies in the day and work at night, she often felt tired and invisible in the city that never seemed to pause. Maybe that's why she noticed him more than others did. Because behind his neat suits and calm face, she sensed the same kind of weariness she carried inside herself. Sometimes, when he looked out of the window for too long, she wondered if he was waiting for someone who never came. And though she didn't know his story yet, she felt a strange kind of connection, a silent understanding that two strangers can sometimes share without words. Night after night, he kept coming, and night after night, she served him the same black coffee with a smile. Neither of them realized that their lives, which seemed so separate, were slowly weaving toward each other in ways neither could yet imagine. The nights kept passing, and his visits never stopped. Every evening, when the shop clock moved closer to 8, Aisha's eyes would instinctively turn toward the glass door. She always expected him, and without fail, he appeared. His routine was so steady that it became almost like a part of the cafe itself. The regular customers came and went, the staff rotated shifts, the background music changed, but his presence remained constant. Still, there was something that Aisha couldn't stop noticing: he looked lonely. It wasn't the kind of loneliness people showed through sadness or tears. His was quieter, hidden behind polite smiles and composed expressions. But Aisha had a habit of observing people closely. She had learned to read small details in customers: the way they held their cups, the way they glanced at their phones, the way their eyes lit up or dulled with fatigue. And in him, she saw traces of a man who carried a kind of emptiness that even coffee couldn't fill. Some nights, when the cafe wasn't too crowded, she noticed how he sat with his coffee longer than necessary. Most people finished their drinks in 15 or 20 minutes and left. But he lingered, sipping slowly, as though he wanted to stretch time. His eyes often wandered to the door, like he was waiting for someone to walk in, though no one ever did. There was a gentleness in his movements, but also a heaviness, as if his heart was tied down by something unseen. Aisha often found herself wondering about his life outside the cafe. Did he go back to an empty apartment? Did he have friends who called him, or family who cared where he was? She couldn't imagine someone like him, well-dressed, refined, always calm, living a life of loneliness. But his eyes betrayed him. They were kind eyes, yes, but they carried shadows, the kind that came only when someone had lost too much or carried too many burdens. One evening, when the city outside was glowing with bright lights, Aisha saw him sitting in his usual spot with his notebook open. He wasn't writing, though. He just stared at the blank page, his pen resting loosely between his fingers. For a long time, he didn't move. Finally, he closed the book, pushed it aside, and leaned back, letting out a sigh so soft it was almost invisible. Aisha felt an ache in her chest as she watched him. She wanted to ask if he was all right, but her words stayed locked inside. The next night, she decided to do something small. When he came in and placed his usual order, she added a small cookie to the saucer with his cup. When he looked up at her, slightly puzzled, she smiled. "On the house," she said lightly. For a moment, he hesitated, Then the corners of his lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you," he said softly, and for the first time, she thought his voice carried more warmth than usual. It wasn't much, just a cookie. But that evening, he took a bite, and for the first time in weeks, Aisha saw him smile to himself as he ate. It was a fleeting moment, but it stayed with her long after he left. Sometimes, she wondered if he noticed her the same way she noticed him. Did he see how she worked tirelessly behind the counter, serving customer after customer with the same polite smile? Did he notice the tiredness in her own eyes when the night grew late and the crowd thinned out? Or was she just a nameless face who handed him coffee every night? She didn't know, but it didn't stop her from caring quietly in her own way. One rainy evening, when the shop was nearly empty, she found him sitting by the window again, staring out at the wet streets. The rain tapped against the glass, and the city lights blurred in the reflection. She carried his order to the table herself instead of calling him to the counter. As she set the cup down, he looked up at her, surprised. "Thank you," he said again, but this time his voice carried something more, almost as if he wanted to say more but didn't know how. Aisha gave a small nod and was about to walk back when she noticed how tired he looked. The words slipped out before she could stop herself. "Long day?" she asked gently. For a second, he seemed taken aback, as though he wasn't used to people asking him such simple questions. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You could say that," he replied quietly. His voice was calm, but his eyes spoke louder than his words. It wasn't a long conversation, but for Aisha, it felt like the beginning of something. For weeks, she had watched him, wondered about him, and now, for the first time, he had shared even a small piece of his world with her. After that night, their exchanges grew just a little longer. He still ordered the same coffee, still sat in the same place, still carried that quiet aura of loneliness, but he began to speak a little more. Sometimes, he commented on the weather. Sometimes, he asked if the cafe was always this busy. Once, he even smiled when she joked about how his coffee order was the easiest to remember. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break the silence that had once surrounded him like a wall. Yet, even as she got these small glimpses of him, Aisha felt that he was holding something back. There was still a mystery about him, a life he carefully kept hidden. The loneliness she had sensed was real, but she didn't know what caused it. She only knew that behind the neat suits, the polite manners, and the quiet routine, there was a man carrying a story he hadn't yet shared. Every night, after closing the cafe, Aisha thought about him on her way home. She didn't know why she cared so much. Maybe it was because she saw in him the same kind of silence she carried within herself. Maybe it was because his visits had become such a steady part of her life that she couldn't imagine the cafe without him. Or maybe it was simply because his presence, though quiet, had touched something deep in her heart that she couldn't put into words. And so, the nights went on. The man kept coming, always alone, always quiet, always with the same coffee. And Aisha kept watching, noticing the details no one else cared to see: the slump of his shoulders after a hard day, the way his eyes softened when someone remembered his order, the faint smiles that came and went like rare visitors. She still didn't know who he really was, but she knew one thing for certain: behind his silence was a man with a story, and somehow, she was becoming a part of it, even if neither of them fully realized it yet. The days kept passing, and by now Aisha was used to the sight of him walking through the cafe doors every evening. His routine had hardly changed, yet something between them had shifted. Their exchanges were no longer just about a cup of coffee. Slowly, their silence had turned into small conversations, and those small conversations had started building something unspoken between them. It began gently. One evening, when the cafe was quiet, she noticed him staring at the rain outside. The window glass was covered with droplets, and the street lights blurred into long streaks of yellow and orange. She placed his coffee on the table and said lightly, "The city looks different in the rain, doesn't it?" He looked up at her, almost surprised by her comment, then followed her gaze to the window. After a pause, he nodded. "It does. Softer somehow." That was the first time he had shared more than a simple answer. Aisha smiled, and though she had other tables to attend to, she lingered for a few seconds longer than usual. He didn't seem to mind. That moment, brief and ordinary as it was, felt like a door quietly opening. From then on, little by little, their conversations grew. He never spoke much about himself, but he listened. If Aisha mentioned how busy her shift was, he would give a small smile and say, "I can see that." If she complained about the music playlist being stuck on the same songs, he chuckled softly. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was genuine, and whenever he laughed, his face seemed to lose some of its weight. One night, when she handed him his cup, he said, "You always remember my order. It makes me feel like this place is a little less lonely." His words caught her by surprise. She didn't expect him to admit something like that. For a second, she saw a glimpse of his heart through the calm mask he always wore. She smiled back, trying to keep her voice light. "It's the easiest order I have. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. You make my job simple." But even after she returned to the counter, his words echoed in her mind. Less lonely. That was exactly what she had thought of him all this time, that he was someone who carried loneliness with him. Now, he had said it aloud, though only in a small way. After that, she began to notice even more details about him. The way his hands sometimes fidgeted with the cup when he was lost in thought. The way his shoulders relaxed slightly when she greeted him with a smile. The way his eyes softened when she asked him something simple like, "How was your day?" He always gave short answers, but even those short answers carried meaning. She never pushed him to share more than he wanted to. Something in her told her that he was a man who valued his privacy, someone who had learned to build walls around himself. But even walls, she knew, sometimes had small cracks. And through those cracks, a little light could enter. One evening, when the cafe was almost empty, she noticed him sitting with a book. She had never seen him read there before. Curious, she walked over and said, "What are you reading?" He glanced up, then turned the cover so she could see. It was a novel, the kind that explored human emotions more than action. She smiled. "I've heard of that one. People say it's sad." He looked at the book for a moment, then said quietly, "Sometimes sad stories make you feel less alone. They remind you that others have felt the same things." His words lingered in the air, and Aisha found herself staring at him for a second too long before she nodded and walked back to the counter. That night, after closing, she couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. He was right, sad stories did carry comfort. And maybe that explained why he came here every night. Maybe he wasn't just here for the coffee. Maybe he was here because the cafe gave him the illusion of company, a place where he didn't have to face his silence alone. Another time, she caught him staring at the door again, his eyes distant. She asked softly, "Are you waiting for someone?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he shook his head with a faint smile. "Not tonight." She wanted to ask more, but something about the way he said it made her stop. It was as if there was a whole story hidden in those two words, but he wasn't ready to share it yet. Despite not knowing his full story, Aisha felt the bond between them growing. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. It was something deeper, something built on small kindnesses and unspoken understanding. She didn't know what he saw in her, but she knew what she saw in him, a man who was trying to carry his world alone, who chose a little cafe in the corner of the city as his safe place. On busy nights, when she rushed between tables and the noise of laughter filled the air, she would glance at his corner and see him sitting there calmly, almost like an anchor in the middle of chaos. And sometimes, when she was tired and overwhelmed, their brief conversations gave her a strange comfort too. It wasn't just him who found peace in the routine, she did as well. Once, when she brought his coffee, he looked up at her and said, "You always seem cheerful. Even when you're tired, you smile." His observation startled her. She hadn't thought he noticed. She laughed lightly. "It's part of the job. Customers don't want to see a tired barista." But inside, she realized something: he did notice her, maybe more than she thought. It wasn't only her watching him quietly all this time, he had been watching her too. The nights blended into each other, and the bond grew stronger without either of them naming it. Aisha never asked him about his personal life, though she sometimes wanted to. She didn't know if he lived alone, if he had family, or what kind of work he did. All she knew was that he was someone who carried silence with dignity, someone who came every night as if the coffee and their small conversations were a lifeline. And though he never said it directly, she could feel it. He was grateful. Grateful for the way she remembered his order, grateful for the way she didn't push too hard, grateful for the simple kindness of treating him not as a stranger in a suit, but as a person who mattered. Aisha didn't know it yet, but her quiet kindness was slowly breaking through walls he had built for years. And in return, his presence was teaching her that sometimes, even the smallest connections could bring warmth in the coldest of nights. The cafe had become a second home for him. By now, even the staff who didn't know his name recognized his face. Some thought he was just another tired office worker, others whispered that maybe he was a writer, given how often he carried a notebook. But to Aisha, he was no longer just a regular customer, he was a part of her nightly rhythm. Their conversations, though still short, had become an important piece of her day. It was a Saturday evening when everything began to change. The cafe was quieter than usual, with only a few customers scattered around. Aisha was at the counter, humming softly as she cleaned the cups, when the door opened. He walked in, as always, but this time something felt different. His steps were quicker, his face brighter, almost as if he had been carrying a secret. He ordered his coffee, and she served it with her usual smile. But before he could walk away, the cafe door burst open again, and a small boy ran inside. The child, no older than 6 or 7, had messy hair and bright eyes. He rushed straight to the man's table and climbed into the chair beside him. "Papa," the boy called happily. Aisha froze. For weeks, she had wondered if he had a family, but seeing the boy call him father felt like a revelation. Her heart skipped. He wasn't alone in life, he was a father. The man Armin, though she still didn't know his name, looked at the boy with a smile that Aisha had never seen before. It wasn't the polite smile he gave to strangers, nor the faint ones he gave her. This one was warm, deep, and filled with love. He gently brushed the boy's hair back. "You ran too fast," he said softly. "What if you slipped?" The boy shook his head with a grin. "I wanted to find you." Aisha, standing behind the counter, couldn't stop watching. For the first time, she saw him in a new light, not as the quiet, lonely man who came for coffee, but as a father whose heart belonged to his child. It made sense now, the way he sometimes looked at the door, as if expecting someone. Perhaps he had been waiting for his son on those nights, or perhaps he simply wished he was there. Soon after, another customer entered, a man in his 30s, carrying a newspaper. He glanced toward the corner and did a double take. His voice carried across the cafe in disbelief. "Isn't that Armin Malik?" Aisha looked up quickly. The name meant little to her at first, but the other customers reacted instantly. Whispers spread like ripples in water. "That's him, the CEO of Malik Enterprises. He's on the news all the time. What's he doing here, in a small cafe like this?" Aisha's eyes widened as realization sank in. The quiet man who ordered black coffee every night, the man who sat alone in the corner, was not just another office worker. He was a well-known millionaire, a man who ran one of the city's most successful companies. She turned her gaze back toward him. He seemed unfazed by the whispers around the room. Instead, he was focused entirely on his son, helping him sip from a glass of milk the staff had brought over. It was almost surreal. A man who probably had access to the most expensive restaurants and private clubs in the city had chosen this small, ordinary cafe night after night. Later that evening, when most of the customers had left and the cafe grew quieter, Aisha found the courage to approach his table. She smiled at the boy first, who grinned back innocently, then turned to the man. "So," she said softly, "I finally know your secret." He looked up, slightly startled, then chuckled. It was a sound warmer than she had ever heard from him. "And what secret is that?" he asked. "That you're not just my quiet customer," she replied gently. "You're Arman Malik. People seem to know you well." For a moment, his eyes held hers, then he sighed. "Yes. That's true." His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness in it. "But in here, I don't want to be known for that. In here, I just want to be a man who drinks his coffee in peace." His honesty touched her more than she expected. "I think you've managed that," she said with a small smile. He gave a faint smile back. Then, after a pause, he added, "I come here because it's the only place where I feel normal. No one expects anything from me here. No board meetings, no decisions, no headlines. Just a cup of coffee, and sometimes, a kind conversation." Aisha nodded slowly, understanding him more clearly than ever. Behind the image of a wealthy, powerful man was someone who craved simplicity, someone who wanted to be seen not for his money or his position, but simply for who he was. That night, before leaving, he introduced his son. "This is Adam," he said, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "He's the reason I keep going." The way he looked at his son was filled with so much love that it softened even the hardest parts of his expression. Aisha bent down slightly to greet the boy. "Hello, Adam. Do you like milkshakes? We make good ones here." The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded eagerly. Arman smiled, a smile that reached his eyes this time. After they left, Aisha stood by the counter, her heart filled with thoughts. The man she had assumed was simply lonely was indeed lonely, but not in the way she thought. He wasn't alone in the world. He had a son who loved him dearly. What weighed on him was something else, something deeper. Maybe it was the pressure of running an empire, maybe the challenges of being a single father, maybe both. Over the next few nights, things felt different. Customers now whispered when they recognized him, but he never let it bother him. He still ordered his coffee, still sat by the window, still spoke to Aisha with the same gentle calm. The only difference was that sometimes, Adam came along. And whenever the boy was there, Aisha noticed the change in him. The loneliness in his eyes faded, replaced by warmth and pride. One night, when Adam had fallen asleep at the table, his small head resting on his father's arm, Aisha walked over and whispered, "He must be very special to you." Arman looked down at his son, his expression tender. "He's my everything," he replied softly. "I lost his mother a few years ago. Since then, it's just been the two of us. I try to give him a normal life, but sometimes," his voice trailed off. Aisha felt her heart ache for him. In that moment, she understood the silence, the weariness, the way he lingered at the cafe. He wasn't just escaping his responsibilities, he was escaping the loneliness that came with carrying them all alone. She didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled gently. "You're doing better than you think," she said quietly. He looked up at her, his eyes soft. "Thank you. Sometimes that's all a person needs to hear." From that night on, Aisha no longer saw him only as the quiet man in the corner. She saw him as a father, as a human being who had built walls not to keep people out, but to protect the fragile parts of himself. And though he was a CEO, a millionaire, a man with influence and power, she realized that in the end, he was simply someone who wanted the same things everyone else did: a little peace, a little kindness, and someone who understood. The nights that followed carried a different feeling. The mystery that once surrounded him was no longer as heavy. Aisha now knew his name, his truth, and most importantly, the reason behind his silence. He was not just the quiet man in the corner anymore. He was Arman Malik, a father, a man who had lost but who was still holding on, and someone who had been carrying his burdens in silence for far too long. For Aisha, every evening now felt more meaningful. She no longer served him coffee like she did for other customers. There was an unspoken connection between them, something fragile but warm, something that grew with every conversation. Whenever she placed his cup on the table, their eyes met for a moment longer than before, as if each was silently acknowledging the other's presence. Adam, his son, also became a familiar face in the cafe. Sometimes he came running in with energy that filled the quiet shop, and other times he sat quietly beside his father, sketching in a small notebook. He had the same eyes as Arman, bright but carrying depth far beyond his age. Aisha liked the boy instantly. His innocence added life to the cafe in a way nothing else could. She would often bring him small treats, like cookies or milkshakes, and his laughter would echo across the room. Arman noticed, of course. One evening, when Adam had fallen asleep on the couch at the far end of the cafe, Arman approached the counter where Aisha was wiping cups. "You're very kind to him," he said softly. Aisha smiled, glancing at the boy. "He reminds me of my little brother. Children should always feel cared for. The world already expects too much from them when they grow up." Arman's expression softened. "You're right. And he has already grown up faster than he should have. Sometimes I worry I can't give him the life he deserves. I try, but it never feels enough." Aisha looked at him, surprised. To her, it seemed impossible that a man with so much could feel like he wasn't enough. But then she remembered the weight of wealth was not always freedom, sometimes it was chains. She answered gently, "Maybe what he needs most is not perfection, but you. Your love is enough." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time Aisha saw his eyes soften in a way that reached deeper than a polite smile. It was as if her words had given him a comfort he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. It wasn't built on grand gestures or dramatic moments, but on small things: the way she remembered Adam's favorite drink, the way he always asked how her studies were going, the way they exchanged smiles across the cafe when the place grew too noisy. These little moments, stitched together, formed something beautiful and real. One evening, the cafe was quiet, and Arman lingered even after Adam had fallen asleep again. He stayed at the counter this time, his coffee in hand. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "how life brings strangers together in the most unexpected places?" Aisha tilted her head, curious. "All the time. I think people cross paths for reasons we don't see at first." He nodded, staring into his cup. "When I first started coming here, I didn't plan for anything. I only wanted a place where I could be invisible. But somehow, I found the opposite. I found someone who noticed me even when I said nothing." Her heart skipped. His words carried a weight that reached her deeply. She smiled, though her voice was soft. Sometimes noticing someone is the only way to remind them they're not alone. For a long moment, they didn't speak, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, like two people who understood each other without needing too many words. By now, Aisha also began to see her own life differently. Working at the cafe had always felt like just a routine, a way to manage expenses while pursuing her dreams. But after meeting Arman and Adam, it became something more. She realized how powerful simple kindness could be, how much it meant to offer a smile to someone carrying the weight of the world. She had touched their lives, but in return, they had touched hers too. One night, after closing the cafe, she stepped outside to lock the doors. To her surprise, Armin was waiting by the street, Adam holding his hand. "We thought we'd walk you home tonight," he said. She hesitated at first, but the sincerity in his eyes made her smile. They walked together through the quiet streets, Adam chatting cheerfully about school and drawings while Armin listened patiently. For Aisha, it felt unusual but comforting, like a glimpse of a family she hadn't expected to be a part of. As they reached her street, Adam yawned sleepily, and Aisha bent down to pat his head. "Good night, Adam," she said warmly. The boy smiled drowsily before holding tighter to his father's hand. Armin looked at her for a moment before saying quietly, "Thank you for being kind to him, and to me." She shook her head gently. "You don't need to thank me. It's easy to be kind to people who deserve it." Something in his eyes lingered on her longer than before, but he didn't say more. He only nodded and walked away into the night with his son. The weeks that followed were filled with the same quiet rhythm, but everything had changed beneath the surface. Their connection was no longer just between customer and barista. It was something unspoken, something fragile but real. A bond built not on wealth or status, but on humanity, on kindness, on shared silences, on the simple act of being present for one another. And though Aisha never asked for more, she knew that in some way, she had become important to him, just as he had become important to her. The city outside was still loud, fast, and unforgiving, but inside the cafe, every night carried a warmth that neither of them had expected to find. For Armin, it was a reminder that even in his loneliness, there were still people who could see him for who he truly was, not the CEO, not the millionaire, but a father and a man with a heart. For Aisha, it was proof that the most extraordinary stories often began in the most ordinary places. And so, night after night, he continued to come for coffee, not because he needed it, but because it had become the symbol of something greater. It was the bridge that connected two lives from completely different worlds, and it carried with it the quiet promise that even the loneliest souls could find light again, sometimes in the simplest of places. Sparkles, that's part 5, fully expanded with around 1,300 words worth of storytelling, keeping it emotional, heartwarming, and clean. Do you want me to now combine all 5 parts into one continuous full story, like a novel with 6,500 plus words, so you have the complete version in one place?